Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining iTech's First Lunch and Learn. Before we begin, I just want to go through a housekeeping checklist. You will all be on mute for the entire hour. Your video's on so we can see you. Therefore, if you're not wearing pants, please do not stand up. If you're in the restroom, please do not take your device with you. The past few months, we have seen a lot of stuff going on. On the bottom of your screen is a chat button. If you have a question for our two panelists following the discussion, please type it there, and we will try to get to as many as time permits. We are kicking off this brand new series by welcoming two acclaimed Israeli experts on public and foreign affairs. We are joined by award-winning author and senior vice president at Shalom College, Dr. Daniel Gordis, together with author and senior research fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and iTech Global Business Board member Dan Diker. Dr. Daniel Gordis and Dan Diker will share their thinking on several urgent issues, including Israel's national unity government, which is actually being presented in the Knesset today, overcoming the coronavirus, and obstacles and opportunities in the current U.S. peace plan. Thank you to Danny and Dan for spearheading the first of iTech's Lunch and Learn series. I'm going to kick off the conversation by asking Dr. Gordis the first question. As we speak, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Co-Minister Gantz are finishing up the negotiation of the ministerial portfolios for one of the largest governments in Israel. Is this government here to stay after a year and a half stay? Can this government weather the crisis that Israel faces?
Well, first of all, let me just begin by thanking you, Wendy, for the introduction, and by thanking Dan for the invitation to join with you tonight. It's an extraordinarily important cause that I've actually personally enjoyed, so it's an honor for me to be with all of you, to see some familiar faces and a lot of faces that I hope I'll get a chance to meet down the road when mankind reinvents airplanes and we all find each other on each other's continents. So the truth of the matter is that the timing of your question is actually quite extraordinary, because as we speak at this very minute, the agreement is falling apart. And the Knesset, which was supposed to be sworn in tonight, is now not going to be sworn in tonight. The Likud is apparently, the news is very sketchy on this. I see Dan furiously checking the internet there to see what's going on. But in any event, when I was actually just having a quick bite of dinner between this and my previous Zoom call, they had delayed the swearing in from tonight when it was supposed to be to Sunday. And apparently the division of the portfolios, as you say, I think the largest government in Israel's history, meaning the greatest number of ministerial portfolios and so on and so forth. The division of those portfolios was still apparently being debated, and some members of the Likud were unhappy with the deal that Bibi had made with Gantz. So we actually don't even know what the government's going to be. And not knowing what the government's going to be means that it's hard to say something about something very, very thoughtful, at least about whether or not it's going to make it. Look, I think we all, we can probably use this as a way of segueing a little bit into the virus issue, which you raised towards the end of your question. Israelis simply want stability at this point. Israelis have no desire to go to a fourth election. Israelis, by the way, are much less interested in the whole issue of what's called annexation, even though it's not really annexation. I know that Dan will speak about that at length a little bit later. American Jews are talking about Israel's possible annexation, quote unquote, much more than Israelis are. Israelis are focused really on two main things which are very much related. And they expect whichever government is in place to forward these two agendas. And it's not, in that regard, it's not that different from America and other places. Israelis want to conquer the virus, and Israelis want to restore their economy. And so let me just say a brief word, perhaps, since we don't know what the government is going to look like, but it's clearly, I think its future is very much indicated by its present, meaning that it's going to be wobbly from the very get-go, and it's very hard to know if it's going to survive. As I was suggesting, the reason to think that it might is that Israelis just simply don't want political turmoil now. The reasons that it might not is because it really does sort of bring about the end of Bibi Netanyahu's prime ministerial reign, with something which he clearly doesn't want to happen. So many people are suspicious that he'll figure out a way of pulling the carpet out from under Gantz. But we don't know a lot about the government. What we do know a lot about is how Israel has managed this crisis in the course of the last 2 months under Bibi's leadership. And I think, again, whether one is a fan of Bibi or not a fan of Bibi, whether one thinks that he is possibly corrupt or is convinced that he's not corrupt, whatever the case may be, the vast majority of Israelis give him a fair amount of credit for having shepherded the country through this crisis, not flawlessly, not without errors. The airport was supposed to be closed, and then it turns out that people came off American airplanes and went right back to where they were going without stopping, without being checked, without going to isolation centers. There were lots of goofs, but by and large, it's been successful. And I want to just reflect a tiny bit, if I might, on what we've learned about Israel from all of this. And one way I think about of thinking about the whole pandemic, it's not the only way, and it's not true of everything, but one way of thinking about the pandemic is simply to say that this crisis has simply accelerated processes that were already in place in lots of different societies. Give you an example, retail was already suffering in America. Retail's taking a huge hit now. We buy all sorts of things online that my wife had resisted buying online before because she liked going into the shop. And even though I was thinking it would be so much easier just to do it online, now we do it online. I doubt we're going to go back. A lot of Americans, especially of an older generation who were not shopping a lot online, who were not using Amazon the way younger generations are, have had to do that. They're unlikely to go back online. So we were seeing, for example, a gradual easing away from retail. This has been accelerated. The whole WeWork phenomenon was actually easing away from office space. And obviously lots of businesses, law firms, and many others are discovering, wow, we can actually work with basically 0 square footage of space. Why would we possibly, I don't know, Moshe Ronen is sharing a screen, which is not helpful, but okay. Why would we possibly go back to what we had? So I'm just going to try to get myself here. This screen sharing thing. Moshe Ronen, whoever that is he on?
Moshe, can you turn up?
Yeah, there you go. Okay. The person who's controlling this, whoever that is, can actually stop other people from sharing screens if you want. So it can actually not, people do it by accident, it happens.
It's done.
So there's a lot of examples of things that are changing, and I think that pandemic has simply accelerated it. And I think it also not only accelerates things, but it highlights things. Israel, despite all of the conversations to the contrary, is actually a fairly unified society. And the United States, as we've seen over the course of the past 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever number of years, has become an increasingly polarized society. So what the pandemic has done in America, again, doesn't matter which party you are, doesn't matter what your politics are, you can see the pandemic actually making the divisions of American society so strident, people don't even agree about what the facts are anymore. In other words, you saw the president this morning actually claiming that he thought that the number of dead was overstated, and you saw Fauci saying last night that he thought the number of dead was understated. In other words, there's in America actually even a battle about the facts, about whether certain medicines work, certain treatments are effective, and so on and so forth. We have not had that in Israel. In other words, Israelis chose to trust the scientists. Bibi, again, whatever you think of him, chose to try to bring in the best experts that he could. He consulted with Israeli epidemiologists. He consulted with European epidemiologists. He continues to consult with American epidemiologists. So it was a very different response. And this pandemic has actually brought Israelis even closer together than they were before. We don't have a phenomenon, for example, like you have in America, where a lot of Democrats really have no friends who are Republicans, and Republicans have no friends who are Democrats. And I'm not making this up. You really can't make this up. Polls that are done in America of how many Democrats would not want their kids to marry a Republican and how many Republicans would not want their kids to marry a Democrat. We can laugh all we want, but there are serious outfits that do those polls. The mere fact that somebody would ask the question tells you something very important about America. And I can tell you there's no such poll in Israel, and anybody who was asked that question would simply laugh. Nobody from the Likud cares if somebody from, if their kid marries somebody from Blue and White or from Labor or even from Meretz. Everybody in Israel has friends who are from different political parties. It's just the nature of the society. And if there were two communities that were kind of outliers, I'll say two more quick things. If there were two communities that were outliers before this whole thing started, which were the Haredi community and the Arab community, it's true, you read in the press about all the violations and so on and so forth on the part of the Haredi community. That did happen. That is still happening. But you also have to remember that the IDF went into Bnei Brak, an entirely Haredi town, when it was really being buffeted by the winds of this infection. And the religious leadership of Bnei Brak welcomed the IDF in and cooperated with it in terms of distributing food and medicine and getting people tested and so forth. That's a huge change. And the same thing happened in Arab towns. And when a recent poll was done of Israel nationally, but especially of the Haredim and the Arabs, do you feel part of the general fabric of Israeli society? The numbers had gone up everywhere, and among the Arabs, it had gone up 30-something% from last year, which is an unbelievable hike. It might drop down a little bit because it got it right at the right moment. But my point is, what I think that has happened here in the pandemic is that, number one, it has pointed to the deep fissures in American society, and fundamentally, the profound cohesiveness of Israeli society. Even though everybody loves to talk about the divisions of Israeli society, there is a sense of shared purpose and a sense of shared mission and values and so forth. The only other thing that I want to point out is that Israelis were very disciplined and Israelis were very compliant. When we were told for a number of days you were not allowed to leave your house, many people, most people, did not leave their house. When we were told that you had to wear a mask outside or you were going to be fined, the overwhelming number of people wore masks and didn't push it. The scenes that you're seeing now in the American press of people actually bringing armed civilians outside their shops to enable them to open up, even though the law of whatever state it may be has said that they can't open up, that kind of anti-establishment, anti-government stuff, we're just not seeing here at all. You know, you see 500 people go to a barbecue or a campfire for Lag BaOmer. It's true, and some weddings and some funerals have been too big. But the idea that anybody would bring arms to say that they are going to violate the strictures of the government, and that would be seen as an act of patriotism by some people, that's just not happening here. So I think, again, the pandemic has highlighted things that were already true. It's highlighted the fissures of American life and the cohesiveness of Israeli life, and highlighted the compliance deeply built into Israeli society, because we have had national crises before, and we have been told before by the government what to do and how to comport ourselves in the middle of these crises. And Israelis have learned very often that doing that is life or death. And that has led, thank God, to, I think, a very successful battle against the virus in Israel. It's not over. We could have a second wave. All that is true. But so far, the number here are quite encouraging. And one can only hope and pray that the numbers will similarly improve on the American side as well.
Danny, thanks very much for that initial set of observations. I'm just gonna piggyback on what you've said here and mention a couple of compelling points that have not come out in the mainstream media in the United States. And that is that what Israel proved in the last 8 weeks is that it truly is a startup nation. If you look at the context of how the Israeli government and the Israeli public behaved over the last 8 weeks to get its arms around what Netanyahu has called the invisible enemy. And in fact, if you look at the invitation that was sent out by Jackie and Wendy, you'll see that the language that is used is the language of war, the language of military, the language of that Israel knows so well. And it's really true. From the very beginning, the Israeli government looked at this as another wartime effort. The difference was, and this is before I get into tell you what was really unique about Startup Nation, is that everybody was on the same side. Everybody's on the same side. The invisible enemy was the ultimate democratic enemy. It attacked everyone equally. And Yossi Klein Halevi made this very important point in an article that he wrote recently, and that is that for the first time, the Israeli Arab public and the other minorities in Israel, the Circassians, the Druze, the Christians, and others, saw themselves very much in the Israeli reality, and the polling numbers bear that out. There was no Arab-Israeli conflict context to the type of joint experience being on the same side opposite this invisible enemy. Now, why was Israel the ultimate startup nation, proving the point of the book and the concept? Just within days after I would call it early March, when we saw that, we saw the graph starting to shoot up vertically in terms of the number of infections, the number of ill folks, and the number of critically ill folks. Our Minister of Defense, who will be the Minister of Defense probably for another 24 hours or up to 24 hours, Naftali Bennett, who's an American-Israeli guy. He's a Startup Nation guy himself. He's someone that bought and sold a company in New York called Toyota. He is the ultimate entrepreneur. Within hours, in the beginning of March, he was already in touch with the high-tech divisions of the Israeli intelligence community. He was in touch and working with the Epidemiological Institute at Bar Ziona. He was mobilizing all of Israel's high-tech security and non-security capabilities to locate ventilators through our Mossad and other security agencies in countries with which we have no diplomatic relations. He mobilized the 8200 unit of the IDF intelligence, which is a very secret unit, in order to figure out how does Israel follow those who have been ill, and to make sure that those quarantine themselves, even at, and this is where Dr. Gordis makes a very important point. The Israeli public was fully compliant, even with drastic measures that limited their democratic freedoms for a limited period of time. Those, of course, were passed by the Knesset, suggested by the government. But from a Startup Nation point of view, we had a defense minister that was on steroids in terms of figuring out ways to get testing kits, to make sure that people were quarantined, to make sure that the government could actually monitor those who were sick so that they wouldn't spread the disease. This was perceived very quickly in Israel as a life or death situation, with the possibility of tens of thousands of people being critically ill. So the company mobilized in a very entrepreneurial way. Now, point number two is that Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think one of our leading news analysts put it this way: it was an advantage that Prime Minister Netanyahu is known as a hypochondriac, because he wanted to make sure that this virus was contained and managed as quickly as possible. And I think that we saw Netanyahu on television every single night as the chief, as the quote unquote chief scientist, as the chief spokesman, as the chief synthesizer of information. This prime minister knew every number, that he knew every option, and he was the one communicating to the entire public and to the rest of the government, even to a fault in this very highly centralized government we have. But on the other hand, decisions and the execution of decisions happened very quickly in contrast to the United States, which of course is a federal system. And so you have all of the tensions and competitions between the national level, the state level, and the local level. That was not the case in Israel, and it really allowed Israel to move very, very quickly to isolate those that were ill, to find to find testing kits and to find solutions. And I think it's really no surprise that as of this phone call, there are two different Israeli companies that have already going to the FDA with very effective initial tests for not a vaccine yet, but for a medicine that is proven itself to be highly effective in clearing out the lungs. So Israel has been on a wartime footing for the last couple of months, and it's extraordinary to see what stuck out in my mind. And with this, I'll just end this particular answer, is to see the engagement of Arabs and Jews, or Muslims, Christians, and Jews, let's put it that way, working together in extraordinary acts of loving kindness. Arab doctors, Arab nurses, bringing in Sifrei Torah to elderly Jews who were unable to read from the Torah. There's even a story, as some of you may remember, of an Arab nurse in one of the hospitals reading the 4 questions on Seder night for sick Jewish patients who were unable to do so for themselves. These were not isolated incidents, and as Daniel had pointed out, there is polling numbers from April that is backing up an extraordinary development, and that is that over 70% of Israeli Arabs in 2 separate polls last month have identified themselves as Israeli or Israeli Arabs as opposed to Palestinian. This is a major shift in the identity, in the social identity polling and the pluralism index that we have. I'm going to turn to Daniel and ask you, Daniel, did you notice this type of social shift yourself during the crisis? You mentioned that it did unite people.
Yeah, look, I think what you pointed to, Dan, is exactly right. I'm going to make one additional point in addition to the excellent points that you made about Bibi. That he's a hypochondriac, may be a good thing. He's also a former commando, and commando units always work on the basis of worst case scenario. You're going to go into something. What's the worst case scenario? What are all the things that can possibly go wrong? Because you have to get all the guys out. That's always the primary goal. So as a son who was in a unit like that for many years, as somebody who has a son that was in that, you hear the thinking over and over and over again. It's a worst case scenario. Let's assume that everything that can go wrong does go wrong. How do we still get it done? And I think Bibi brought that military footing that Dan was talking about so eloquently before to bear in that as well. And I think that's helpful. Look, I think we saw it here. First of all, we saw the social cohesion in terms of things that people are doing. There were just unbelievable stories that Dan pointed to. For example, Israel now, by the way, in contradistinction from most American hospitals, does allow relatives to be with dying COVID patients in their last moments. Now, thank God we have very few of them. We lose one or two a day. Some days we don't lose anybody. I think the new infections in the entire country were down to 15 or 20 yesterday. I mean, again, this could rebound. We all know that. But Israel had the same policy of not letting anybody be with these people at the end. And now it's changed its policy, which I think is also a very Jewish response. The idea is that they can't go alone. There is somehow enough hazmat material and equipment to put these people in, and now you can go. You can hold their hand. You're obviously behind a mask. You're obviously suited up. You're wearing a glove. But people are now not dying alone in Israeli hospitals, which is an extraordinary thing. It's a national health policy that was born out of that kind of compassion. But even before we had that policy, right at the very, very beginning, when we were really all being just buffeted by the winds of this and no one knew how to respond, the first man who passed away was a Holocaust survivor, and he was in a COVID unit. All the people inside the COVID unit, of course, were able to see and talk to each other, so they were already all infected. And he was doing fine, actually, until he started to crash. And then all the beeps and the buzzers and the alarms went off. And doctors came in. Excuse me one moment. It's the cost of like the 8th Zoom call here when it's the day when it's, for me and Dan, it's 7 o'clock in the evening. But anyway, when the doctors came in, they took a look and they saw that there really wasn't anything that they could do. They tried to make him comfortable, but then there was really not much to do. All the people in the unit gathered around his bed. He didn't know them or hadn't known them for very long. They sang to him. They held his hands. They told him that they loved him. These kinds of stories made their way across. It really brought out something really very beautiful in Israel. And we're seeing it, by the way, in the States too. I mean, the applauding of first responders and all kinds of really wonderful stories in the States as well. But I can tell you, our students at Shalem are doing all kinds of things for people, bringing food and medicine to the elderly who are locked in. Things that happened here, for example, on Holocaust Memorial Day. For Holocaust survivors, Holocaust Memorial Day is the one day of the year when they get the recognition that they really deserve to have, frankly, 365 days a year. Many of them live too low on the socioeconomic ladder. In my own personal view, it's not one of Israel's great points of pride. But in any event, this is an important day, and they were all locked in. What are you going to do for these Holocaust survivors on a day when they can't come outside, they can't go to ceremonies? What happened was that police officers and soldiers, men and women in blue and in green, went outside their porches, went outside their residences, and saluted them during the siren, saying that they were really the heroes of Israeli society. They are the heroes of the Jewish people. So while it's true everyone was applauding, and rightly so, the first responders and the doctors and so forth, we've found it in our hearts to acknowledge and reach out and to embrace others who really needed it and deserved it at various points in time. The same thing with families of fallen soldiers on Yom HaZikaron and so forth. So we have seen all over the world, thank God, people reaching out and doing extraordinary things. We've seen it in a particularly Jewish way, mindful of Jewish history here in the Jewish state.
Danny, I want to make a sharp turn because we're trying to keep ourselves on time, and Jackie's doing a great job in signaling just in terms of time constraint. I want to make a sharp turn from the government and the relative success we've had in managing and overcoming the first battle on coronavirus into the foreign policy. This is no less important. we are at an inflection point here. Secretary Pompeo was here yesterday. My understanding is he did not talk about the U.S. peace plan. He had other things much more in the portfolio of Iran and China, which we won't get into right now, because I want to focus very much on what has been, in my estimate, as an analyst and a former journalist with a number of different outlets, near total misreporting on what is really going on with the U.S. peace plan and what is not going on with the U.S. peace plan. The headline from the New York Times to CNN to across the board is Israel is annexing Palestinian land. And I think we need to create some context here to really understand what this peace plan is and what this peace plan is not. Danny, if you just indulge me for 3 minutes, I just want to create I'd like us to move from personality to policy, because in the last few years, there has been a conflation of personality versus policy. We're very well aware that Netanyahu's connection to Trump is a very unpopular coupling from a personality point of view, from a personal point of view, relationship point of view. But if we can strip that away for a second and move just into pure policy, what we're seeing with the U.S. peace plan is a return to the Rabin security first approach to Oslo. Yitzhak Rabin, of blessed memory, had since 1967, when his former commander, Yigal Allon, who was Rabin's foreign minister in 1976, the Labor Party under Rabin and previously under Allon were advancing something called defensible borders for Israel. In other words, the notion in Israeli society that Israel will always have to either apply sovereignty or security control in the Jordan Valley, which rises up to 4,200 feet. Many of you, all of you have been to Israel. You know, when you're looking eastward towards Jordan from the Judean Samarian hill ridge, you see that there is a wall, a security wall that is constituted by those natural hills. And if you go to the top of those hills and look west, you are in a topographically superior position to protect all of Western Israel going to the coast. This is a national, this is an issue of national unity on that point. All the leaders of blue and white, in addition to Mr. Netanyahu, agree that Israel will always control or apply Israeli law to the Jordan Valley. So this notion that Israel is actually illegally annexing, is legally not true, and from a security point of view, it does not at all reflect what is happening in Israeli society. What you will see now is more reference points to Israel's rights west of the Jordan River, beginning with the international community's assignment of Israeli legal and diplomatic rights, beginning in 1920, and then again being affirmed by the major powers of the League of Nations in 1922, which was then protected through Article 80 of the UN Founding Charter. You will not hear this in normal mainstream media because it just is beside their point and their narrative. But this is how Israel is looking at this particular issue. The issue of annexation is incorrect. You cannot annex your own territories. And in fact, even though they are disputed and we are subject still to Oslo as the governing diplomacy, it is well known in Israel that our neighbors in the Palestinian Authority already in 2011, 2012, when they declared unilateral statehood, which was a violation of Oslo, we are in a new period. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will agree with a unilateral Israeli move, including in Israel. But I've just tried to create a little bit of context here from a security standpoint and a legal standpoint, not saying whether Israel should actually mobilize its right at this time, but that those rights exist and the security consensus is there. Daniel Gordis, what is your sense of the Trump plan?
Well, let's just say something about this whole notion of whether Israel will actually, put its sort of cast Israeli sovereignty over some of these lands. As I said before, at the very, very beginning, it's actually generated a lot more discussion abroad, and especially in the United States, than it has in Israel. A recent poll showed that 2/3 of Israelis just don't think it's going to happen. In other words, regardless of whether they're in favor of it or not, they just don't think it's going to happen. And while it's true, as Dan pointed out completely correctly, that much has been made of the Netanyahu-Trump relationship, less is being made of that relationship right now, among other reasons that many of those people who were huge Trump supporters, especially in the American Jewish community and among the Israeli Jewish community, for obvious Israeli political foreign policy reasons, are now so troubled by the conduct of the battle against COVID that whole thing is kind of settled down. Dan said before that he didn't want to get into the whole Iran-China thing, and I don't want to get into the Iran thing because we've been through that 1,000 times, and there's not much more to say about that at the moment. But I wanted to say something about China. Pompeo was in Israel yesterday, and the word was that the State Department kind of basically said Pompeo did not come to Israel to talk about quote unquote annexation, even if that's the wrong word. Pompeo was here to talk about China. And this is actually related to the peace plan in the following way. The United States is now going to put very serious conditions with all of its allies on their relationships with China. China has been a very testy relationship. Even before Trump, even under Obama, by the way, it was becoming a tested relationship. It became a much more tested relationship under the beginning of the Trump administration. And obviously now, in light of COVID, China has become the lightning rod, rightly, wrongly, another conversation, doesn't matter, but China has become sort of the arch enemy in this whole COVID thing. The United States is dead set on limiting China's ability to spread its influence and power across the world. China's first step years ago was to exert itself in the Far East, which it did quite successfully. It's now a significant player all around the world, military and economically, and the United States has decided to push back. How does that affect Israel? I'll give you just two quick examples. Israel has awarded to China, a Chinese company, not the government, but to a Chinese company, the contract for rebuilding one of Israel's major ports. It's a huge contract. I mean, it's obviously billions of dollars. And a Chinese company won the contract. The United States Navy, though, docks in that port. And it is not willing to have a Chinese company which could embed any kind of technological stuff in whatever they're doing, have that company. The United States is actually pushing Israel to back out of that deal. Whether Israel will or will not remains to be seen. But the United States is making it clear to Israel and to many others, your relationship with China is now going to impact your relationship with the United States. And therefore, you can't really separate China from the Trump peace plan, because if Israel was to rub Trump's feathers the wrong way on China, we could see very big shifts when it comes to support for what Trump had originally outlined in the peace plan also. Israel will build the region's largest desalination plant ever in a place called Palmachim, and Chinese companies are actually also bidding on the construction of that. And apparently, the rumor has it at least, that Pompeo was here to make it very clear, Chinese companies cannot bid on that project. Now, what he actually said, I don't know, I wasn't there. I was socially isolating, but, and even if I hadn't been, I wouldn't have been invited. But my point only is that the Chinese thing and the Trump peace plan are not at all separated because, and Dan knows this, of course, very, very well, because if Israel is to arouse Trump's ire on China, Israel will find Trump pulling back very, very quickly on the peace plan. The peace plan, I will say this, so the only thing that I will say about the peace plan, it's not a peace plan. I mean, it's not going to bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It is a way of kind of drawing new borders that are obviously much safer for Israel, that many people believe are actually the enactment and the embodiment of rights that Israel has had long enough. As Dan said, there's virtually no Israelis who in their wildest dreams imagine giving up the Jordan River Valley. And I think what the Trump peace plan does is done what Trump has done in many other areas, because let's just call it like it is. Nuance not being his strength. If Israel is not giving up the Jordan Valley ever, so let's just call it like it is. There's no point having the Jordan River Valley if you can't get to it from Jerusalem and the rest of Israel. So going through Ma'ale Adumim and that whole highway that we now know to the Dead Sea, which has been rebuilt over the years, that's clearly not going back either, because you can't give that up and keep access to the Jordan River Valley. So in many respects, what the plan does is it simply concretizes it. It shows American support for what many Israelis have long seen. Israelis right and left, by the way, have long seen as non-negotiable. It's not a peace plan because the Palestinians have, of course, rejected it outright, as they told us they would, and they have. And I think here, by the way, it was Pompeo himself who said, you don't like the plan, put something else on the table. And of course, the Palestinians have brought no alternative to the table because there's no possibility that any peace plan would be a peace plan. There is no possibility of any peace plan happening. And I say this, by the way, anybody who thinks that Israelis are cavalier about that just doesn't know Israelis. And we have a soldier who was very badly injured today, very serious condition, a car ramming attack near Hebron. We have a soldier who was killed the day before yesterday, or yesterday, I guess it was yesterday, up in north. I think it was in Jenin or Nablus, whatever it was. We lose kids all the time. Not day in and day out, thank God, but we lose them all the time. One of my students said on Memorial Day here, they were talking about their own experiences, and these are all kids who are fine, right? I mean, they are healthy in body, healthy in soul, but they all served, and they were talking in a screen that looked very much like this on Yom HaZikaron. And one kid said something that I will probably never forget. He said, in Israel, every day is Yom HaZikaron. Meaning in Israel, we carry around the wounds and the burden of the friends that we lost, the fathers that we lost, the uncles who didn't come back the same. Every single day, anybody who knows the heart and soul of Israel knows that there are very few Israelis who do not desperately want to see an end to this conflict. But I think the proof was in the pudding. When Pompeo said, you don't like this deal? That's fair. Why don't you put something alternative on the table? And that was the end of the conversation. It's not a peace plan because there's no peace plan to be had, but it is, I think, an expression of American support for what Israelis right and left see as their most fundamental basic security needs.
That's true. We're going to go to questions now. May I just make one last mini point that I neglected, Daniel, before you said, this is the first time that the Israeli center-left and center-right agreed with the potential establishment of a Palestinian state on 70% of the West Bank. This is a very significant a victory, frankly, for the prime minister, because even Bennett was encouraging the hawkish Yamina party to accept the deal, which does call absolutely for the establishment of a Palestinian state in the same borders that the Labor Party was talking about for years, since 1967. So there's a real consensus move towards this being a real offer with a $50 billion support behind it. And you see for the first time that the Arab Sunni powers, the Saudis and the Gulfis, are furious with the Palestinian Authority. I say this with authority because they're not accepting the possibility of offering a different plan or accepting this plan with reservations. So the Palestinian Authority has completely isolated itself in the Arab world, aside from Iran. And this is also a new reality that we're in, that we have closer relationships much with the Arab world than we do with many European countries vis-a-vis this particular plan. So let's go to questions, Jackie. Jackie?
Unmute, Jackie.
Unmute.
Good afternoon, everyone. That was extremely interesting, informative, and we're very much appreciative, Dr. Gordis and Dan Diker, for this briefing. And I'm sure there are many questions. We did get one question in advance that I will put on the table now. And then if you'd like to ask a question, our chat feature is not working. So if you go down to the participant tab at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a hand, and you can press the hand and we'll call on probably 3 people to ask questions. So Dan, this question's for you.
Okay.
Someone wanted to know how ITEC, Israel Tennyson Education Centers, responded to the coronavirus and how it pivoted to address the new needs in the communities across Israel.
Well, I think for the first time in 45 years, Jackie, the ITEC was faced with a crisis of unknown proportions, and it stepped up to the plate and went way beyond. In fact, the mainstream media here was reporting that because of the tremendous the united embrace of North American, South African Jewry, as well as the Israelis, they raised about $100,000 to feed hundreds of families that simply didn't have food on the table, and therefore the Israel Tennyson Education Centers was actually for the first time noted as sort of the 911 address, if you will, socially speaking, economically speaking, for thousands of kids. I mean, 6,000 kids have been, in my understanding, have been contacted several times a week by the managers in the different centers everything from psychological counseling to emotional coaching to tennis, to figuring out how to practice tennis in your backyard or your living room or your terrace if you can. There has been a very intimate, highly engaged a relationship between the children and all of the centers in the towns and cities where they live. So it really it makes the Israel Tennis Center a social, economic, psychological, family-oriented entry point for students all over Israel. That was the vision of the tennis center, Jackie, back in the 70s when we first got launched. And I think here was, in a way, it was the capstone. It was a climax of 45 years of what we've been envisioning and doing on the ground on the tennis court. Here, I really believe with Erez Vider and Hans Felius at the reins, you know, we all know what happened every day at the center because Hans wrote an involved email every day reporting exactly which children, what cities, what happened. And I think that there's a sense of emotional and psychological urgency in Israel within the tennis center community and the larger community because of the really stepping up to the plate and proving itself as a major embrace for the children of Israel.
Thank you very much, Dan. Is there anyone, does anyone have questions now? I don't see any hands up. If you do have a question, why don't you just unmute your button if you can't find the hand. Judith Krieger.
I think it was Dr. Gordis who started by saying that as we speak, the cooperation between Likud and Blue and White was just being dismantled. Can you explain a little bit more about why? Do you know any of the reasons why this was happening?
Well, as I said, it was literally happening in the 10 minutes that I had between my previous Zoom conversation and this one. And unlike many of you, probably, I have actually been focused on this and I haven't been surfing the web while we've been having this conversation. So I don't know. What I read was that they were supposed to swear in the Knesset tonight. Likud had wanted to delay it till Sunday night because of some internal issues in the Likud about the division of ministerial portfolios. Blue and White had said that it did not want to delay the swearing in of the Knesset. And when I last checked at around 6:30ish my time, which was 11:30ish your time, or 10 minutes before that, they had decided to postpone it. Apparently over internal Likud politics over the division of ministerial portfolios. I read that Benny Gantz, who had resigned as Speaker of the Knesset to make room for the next Speaker as part of the new agreement, rescinded his resignation as Speaker of the Knesset. So he's holding on to that in the meantime. But that really is all I know. It was literally happening just as we began to gather for this call.
Judith, there's a context here of lack of trust across the board, not only between the traditional suspicions between the Likud and Blue and White, but what has happened here is that you have a newfound lack of trust within the right wing, the nationalist camp, with Naftali Bennett, our outgoing defense minister, head of Yamina, not being invited into the coalition. They did not negotiate an entry into the coalition for the first time since forming that nationalist bloc over a year and a half ago, going into the first of 3 elections. And on the left, even more dramatically, or the center left, there has been a real explosion, a nuclear explosion between Benny Gantz and his other coalition partners in the Blue and White coalition. And I mean, we've seen a type of lack of trust within his camp that one could not have imagined would have happened. So here you have this context where everyone's suspecting everyone, and they really need to build a newfound trust in this coalition. Ironically, on the heels of an tensions within the right wing and intra or tensions within the left center coalitions as well.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. Amy Hendricks had a question. Amy?
Okay. Like so many of us, I'm spending a lot of my quarantine time binging, and I'm just finishing up an Israeli program called Our Boys, which is about in 2014 when the 3 teenagers were kidnapped and killed. And there's such hatred between the Arab communities, notably West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, and the right in Israel. And I just want to say that if this pandemic, if this disaster brings our communities together, it'll truly be the next Hanukkah miracle. And I'm really proud of all the Israelis and all the Jews for reaching beyond and lifting everybody up. This is something we really have to look forward to.
Thank you, Amy. Dan, Dr. Gordis, do you want to respond to that at all?
I haven't seen it, and the reason that I haven't seen it is it got panned by a lot of the from left to right. I mean, Haaretz panned it, the right-wing Israeli press panned it. A lot of people felt that it was, not sufficiently nuanced and sophisticated. So I have to confess, I am also binging. I will say that I am not going to share with you what I am binging, although I will put in a very good plug for Money Heist, which I think is excellent, and Fauda, which is completely unrealistic but also fun. So I haven't seen Our Boys. I heard it much discussed. And most Israelis that I know, maybe Dan, you have, but most Israelis that I know ended up not watching it.
No, but I think that that's true, and I'm included in that because there's no context. I think that one thing, Daniel, I've learned in whatever the 30 years of being here is how important context and nuance is in any type of social or political discussion about Israel, because it's completely missing. From the 500 to 800 word articles that you see in the broadsheets, the daily broadsheets in the United States, and even in Israel, by the way. But I will say one thing, and it's, I think, an important point that Amy's pointing to, and that is the Tennis Center had a social vision for Israel, based on dignity, and based on equality, and based on moral excellence, and based on inclusivism. And that really attracted me to the Tennis Centers 40 years ago, and it stayed with me for these decades being in Israel. And I think, just to pick up on what Amy says, I see it happening in Israel on the ground. There is far more engagement on the ground in Jerusalem, just as an example, between people, whether it's doctors, nurses, orderlies, first responders. It is really heartwarming to see it, and it's happening more and more today. This was the vision of the Tennis Center, and I see it being acted out on the ground, and I think it creates a tremendous opportunity to really maximize that aspect of Israeli society, because with all of the BDS and the anti-Israel invective going on, and these horrendously anti-Semitic Corona conspiracy theories going on in the United States, in Europe, in Iran, in Turkey, against the Jewish state, what we're seeing is now the actualization of the potential of greater social harmony between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. And from my point of view, that has to be one of the greatest strategic objectives for us going forward, is to have affirmative action and to have a greater and continuing engagement between the Israeli Jewish community and the Israeli Arab community. And it's happening. It was a vision. It's happening more. And as Amy suggested, we need to push it at the Tennis Center, Tennis Education Center, and throughout Israeli society, because that's really our strategic and moral imperative.
Thank you. One last question. Robert Barron, did you want to ask a question?
Jackie, it's Eddie Trieber. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I want to follow up on what was just said, and I want to ask an impossible question. I think it's very encouraging to hear about the cooperation and the relationships between Arabs and Jews relative to the virus. But what do you think, if any, the long-lasting effects of that will be? And where do you see Jewish-Arab relations in general going forward?
Well, if I can just jump in, I think that Dan said it beautifully. I mean, I think that what you're seeing at the tennis centers is a microcosm of what's happening in Israeli society at large. More and more Israeli Arabs are choosing, they do call themselves Israeli Palestinians or Palestinian Israelis, which is understandable given the culture from which they come. But they also understand that, you know, for example, the kind of healthcare that they have access to in a pandemic like this is entirely different from what the Palestinians have made available to their own citizens in the West Bank, and what other Arab countries like Iran have done in terms of misleading their own citizens. I'm actually very bullish. I'm very optimistic, as is Dan, as Dan just expressed. I think that it's going to take time. It's complicated. Relationships between majorities and minorities in most Western countries are very complicated. And it's true, obviously, not only in Western countries. Look at India, look at Bangladesh. I mean, they're all over the world. It's very complicated. We're moving forward. And we're seeing really, I think, extraordinary displays of a fundamental sense of Israeliness on the part of Haredim, on the part of Arabs, on the part of people of all different social and economic walks of life. There will still be inequality, there will still be disagreements, but I am very proud of how Israel has comported itself over the last couple of months. Very grateful to a leadership with which I don't always agree politically on the left and on the right, but to a leadership that has comported itself with dignity and with seriousness and has taken science very seriously. I'm proud, as we said at the very outset, of an Israeli population that has been exceedingly compliant and obedient with what were very restrictive orders. By the way, including tracking us with our cell phones, every single person that we met, people that we walked by on the street, and so on and so forth. Everybody understands that that's an invasion of our privacy, and the Supreme Court put very strict limits on when and how and what, but Israelis were willing to accept that and really didn't push back at all, because we had a sense we're in this together and we got to beat this thing together. So far, we have beaten this thing together. Are we completely immune to a second wave or third wave? Of course we're not. We have to continue to be vigilant. But I'm very proud of this country. I'm proud of its citizens. I'm proud of its medical professionals. I'm even proud of its politicians, which I don't always say. I'm always proud to be an Israeli, but I feel in the last 2 months that being an Israeli has been not only great pride, but a source of great, great privilege.
Yeah, it's very much so. I wanted to point out just one thing, Daniel, that goes beyond the COVID. I don't know how many people on this call watch the news report. It may have only been in Israel, but when the U.S. peace plan was announced, there was an aspect of it which was the proposed redrawing of lines in the north, in the what's called the triangle, where the vast majority of Israeli Arabs live. This is to answer the question just posed about the future of Israel-Arab relations. The mayor of Taibe broke out in tears on national television, insisting that they would never volunteer to move to the Palestinian state, and that they were proud Israelis, and this is their country, and this is their future, and this is where they want their children to excel. And I think that people were really bowled over by in Arab culture, for a man to cry on TV is considered, I mean, the ultimate in self-imposed humiliation. And yet he was overcome with emotion. What they call, it's the greatest irony that he publicly stated a type of fealty and loyalty to this country. Not to get too romantic about it. Obviously, he's not going to become, a member of Jabotinsky or the reform, or the revisionist Zionist movement, or even Mapam or Mapai. On the other hand, we now have an opportunity. And this is the moral imperative that the Tennis Center infused in me years ago to approach our fellow citizens of Muslim and Christian descent with a renewed sense of brotherhood and sisterhood, and they're ready for that, and I think we're ready for that. And Daniel has pointed out that the virus, ironically, has created a silver lining, if you can say it, in Israel, and that is one of the opportunities we have. And I think on every level, politically, socially, economically, culturally, we have got to take advantage of this moment.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining this fantastic conversation. And Danny and Dan, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much for your
Pleasure.
time.
It's an honor. Thank you so much.
So nice. Just one more thing. Our next iTech Lunch and Learn will be May 27th at 11:30. Details to follow via email. If anyone has any comments today about today's Lunch and Learn, please let us know. We love the feedback, and just have a great day. Thank you.